Welcome in to chapter 12. We're going to talk about contract work for a bit. This is a shorter chapter, so bear with me on this. Introduction. Contract work with game studios can be great work, if not unreliable in the long term. The nature of contract work in general is short term versus permanent employment, so that is the nature of the beast, right? Um, this is basically just freelancing in a work from home state, but specifically with Gamedev studios. So it encompasses the pros and cons. It offers all the flexibility and schedule as freelance generally does, but can garner higher pay rates. You will generally get this type of work by contacting or getting contacted by an outsourced hiring manager. These folks will often function just like other hiring managers, except they specialize in outsourcing. Occasionally, you'll be contacted by a regular hiring manager or a director. It really depends, but nowadays, there's usually someone in place to manage the outsourced work for product within the studio team, and that's who's going to be contacting you. That's also going to be your ongoing point of contact. So the person you turn things into, the person who then delivers feedback to you, etc., and so on. Let's briefly look into what contract can entail. Upsides. You will usually be working with multiple clients and working on multiple projects at a time. This can help you avoid focused burnout, right? This is basically the benefit of freelance. You're working in game dev because you're working with studios, right? But you're removed from a lot of the internal process. This allows you to avoid the drama, the arguments, the meetings, and all the trappings of studio dev life. I've worked contract with studios a few times, and I really did like the experience of working on something heavy enough to be studio game dev, but not having to be involved in all of the arguments. Like, I would just get packaged feedback instead of having to be in an hour and a half long feedback meeting where people argued over whether the leaf should be pointing to the left or the right, or if it's too brown or too big. Rather than many chefs directing you, there will usually be 1 to 2 points of contact for direction, even when the internal team is offering feedback by committee. Benefits and downsides ensue, right? It really just depends on how you work best, whether this is good. However, contract work, of course, tends to not always be a choice. Sometimes it's the only kind of work you can get. By working with multiple companies, you can buff up your portfolio with recognizable professional work quite easily. Maybe you've seen people like that on is there a problem with the slides, or are we good? We're good? Are we transmitting good? Okay. Maybe you've seen people who have like a Twitter bio or kind of public facing LinkedIns, and they're like worked with Blizzard, Riot, Gearbox, so on, Disney, Nickelodeon, so on and so forth. A lot of those people, they were contractors with these companies, and they were able to buff their resume up with all those names in a short amount of time, doing like 3-month, 6-month contracts with companies, sometimes overlapping, sometimes not even a ton of work. You're like, well, I worked with Disney. What did you do? Well, I did illustration for, a canceled game project or something for 3 months. You still worked with Disney, you know what I mean? And you still have that there. If you work over 40 hours, you're getting paid more. Crunch can happen, but you're not salary. You're generally going to be paid hourly when you do these most of the time, unless you're doing, say, something like illustrating for Hearthstone or something, then you're paid towards cards. Then you want to manage your time more wisely, right? Because you're going to get a set amount of money for a singular illustration and maybe work in bulk. But something that can offset that in the case of Hearthstone, for example, would be that you get longer timeframes to work within. So you can choose and pick when you work on it. The likelihood of getting cool work or hero assets is high, especially now. Something that's really kind of weird that's happened in game dev studios that want to outsource more, which, make no mistake, is to save money, because they will still pay lower amounts for an outsourced studio or outsourced contract work than they will for internal salaried positions that need bonuses and get promoted and want to be, like, I don't know, happy and stuff, is that they'll start sending out really cool, important work to the outsource houses and the contract artists, and then the internal artists have to work on more of the boring stuff. And it's really sad to see that happen But that's what happens. So people will work their ass off to get inside of a studio and then that to work on these things. And then they'll have to oversee people outside of the studio getting to do the work that they work their ass off to get in to be able to do. Easiest exit strategy ever. You can give notice and move on to other opportunities anytime a contract is up. You're not tied to it. More companies are outsourcing more often, so if you link up with an outsourced house or stay solo, chances of work is decent now. Especially in this economy, guys, you really have to be mindful of what opportunities are there. Outsourced houses or outsourced studios, third-party vendors, all of these are basically a studio whose job is to recruit artists. Usually they have what's called a revolving door, people who link up and people who leave, that they assign work to for an existing project. Call of Duty does this a lot, so on and so forth. They'll do it for VFX, 3D, 2D, animation, etc., so on. And what tends to happen is if you're working with that studio, you get paid a rate that they've assigned to you, and they get a huge cut of what they're actually charging the studios for, and that's how they make their money. Good way to get art director credit that might take longer to attain in-house. I did this. I was put on a 6-month project working with Double Fine, and they just popped me as the art director. Like, you're the art director now. You're in charge of these teams. You'll do all this stuff. They vetted me, obviously, and I'd done direction stuff before, but I just had a nice, cool-looking director credit in tandem with a known studio. That was nice. The work was still director work, but I wouldn't have gotten that if I was in-house. That's just how it happens. Great way to get work with US companies if you are outside of the US. Ta-da, there it is, the loophole. If you're like, I'm having trouble getting jobs I would have to relocate for, well, maybe consider contracting with US companies like we talked earlier. Downsides. You will usually be working with multiple clients and working on multiple projects at a time. This can drive you crazy if you can't context switch easily. Context switching, as I mentioned before, is just going from one type of work in one direction to another. So like I'm concepting this, I'm painting this illustration, I'm collating these papers, whatever it is. You are working in game dev, but you are removed from a lot of the internal process. We said there were upsides to that before. There's also downsides. And one of those is that it can leave you without context for the work if communication breaks down. And oftentimes it does, and likely it will. So what that means is that you're like, oh, I've got to do all these character designs or to, paint up this stuff. And you don't really know where that fits in the puzzle that is the game that's being worked on. And you don't really see the other work necessarily. Some places are better at this than others. It's just something to keep in mind that might happen. You can lose time for work while waiting for your contact to inquire internally about design specifics, adjustments, or gathering feedbacks. I had a 3-week window once for feedback when I was doing a contract. That is 3/4 of a month, my friends, to wait for feedback on a thing that I didn't get paid for until it was completed. That's almost 1/12 of a year. Be mindful of schedules when you enter into these contracts. Ask for this stuff not just to protect yourself, but also just so you can fulfill the role well with the company you're working for, stuff like that. You won't be getting benefits in most cases, nor will you be getting PTO, right? You're not working for the company. You're working as an independent contractor on your own, and so they're not usually going to give you health benefits and stuff. There have been cases where that happens, but don't expect it. This won't be salary, is often paid per item. Hourly paid per item is going to happen way more than someone being on salary on contract. That's reserved for internal. Sometimes company deadlines can be tight, real tight. Like their expectation for using a contractor is they're going to benefit more than if they hired someone internally most of the time. That means they want to pay less, they want to get things sooner, right? They want to tighten that up, make number go up, infinite profit, to the moon, whatever that garbage is going to be. Work will come with contracts, and you are not guaranteed further work. Sometimes your contract will be like, hey, it's going to, I'm going to be getting this much amount of work monthly for this length of time. I work with outsourcing vendors right now. My current position is that of an internal art lead at a principal pay rate, meaning like my rank is principal, which is above senior. I'm a lead within the company, and I'm also in charge of pipelines that deal with outsourcing vendors, meaning if we were to contract somebody, which we do, quite a few somebodies, I'm the point of contact mentioned earlier. and I will be working directly with them. Our contract with a lot of those vendors is a certain amount of turnaround work within a given period, usually like whatever number per month, but we also guarantee them that amount of work for 6-month blocks, meaning half a year. Then when that comes up, we renew for another half a year and so on. We have to give them the work for that 6 months, but we never are guaranteed to give them a future contract. By way of that, they also aren't guaranteed to be available for future contracts. Those are things you can negotiate, but don't expect that, oh, I got contract work with this company, that's my job forever. Like, don't ever read beyond the contract. Don't assume, and don't think anything exists that you haven't had both you and the other party sign. Contracts, 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 lots of them. There's going to be a lot of contracts. And if you don't like that shit, that's unfortunate, because you're going to be constantly having to sign and get on NDAs and all kinds of different stuff with each different company you work with if you're working with multiples. Invoices, 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 same thing. When simple things like card art that I was doing with Hearthstone before I moved internally, it's just you invoice either groups of cards or singular cards. It's not that hard. You can make an invoice template, but some people just hate, that kind of secretarial stuff. I actually really hate it too, but you got to get used to it. If you're doing freelance now, you're probably overlapping with contract work a lot more than you would have, say, 10, 15 years ago. So you might be used to this anyways. Contract is not a good avenue to move into full-time at studio, as they rarely hire contractors into internal full dev. This is true. If you work with a outsourcing studio, this is generally considered headhunting, and many times, depending on how it would work, is illegal for them to hire you because you are working with a different company. If you are working contract and people are promising that if you do enough contract work, they might consider you for internal hire, be suspicious of that. Get some things in writing. You know what I mean? It's not that it doesn't happen. It's that most of the time, the reason they're working with contractors is because they didn't want to hire internally. They don't want to hire long-term, and they want to be ready to ditch you the moment they can, because profit is the word of the day. Doesn't mean it doesn't happen. But just don't go in with the expectation that you're in good because you did some contract with Riot and now they're totally going to move you in-house. It's not a guarantee in any way. Just like studio dev, it's harder to get contract work if you don't already have a track record of doing so. This is becoming less true over time, to be fair, which is good, because you want new blood to come in, but the better your track record looks, the more likely they're to pick you up, because there's a lot of people available for contract now. Competition is fierce. Conclusion. Contract work is a good alternative if you love the work but don't want the studio dev life. For all the downsides, you still get to work in games for established studios. If you can't get hired internal, also, this can be good to have on your resume for when you do apply for internal, right? You may not leapfrog directly from that contract, but you can use that contract as a stepping stone for other companies. When the products ship, you still get to post that you worked on a shipped project on your resume. You'll see these in a lot of ArtStation drops and on social medias, where a ton of social medias, where you'll see a lot of people drop a whole bunch of art they did, and you'll be like, oh, well, they're all associated with this company, and you'll find a ton of them were contract people, and they're just as excited, and they get to show that, and they get some notoriety for it, and it's good for their career. Just be sure to say you worked with a company and not for them. I went over that on resumes. This is an important thing to denote as a difference. When you work for a company, generally the assumption will be you were internal. When you worked with a company, that discussion can go, were you contract or in what capacity? If you're trying to fool people that you worked internally as a full-time hire for a company, don't do it. It's probably going to bite you in the ass later, and it pisses everybody off who actually got that job. If you're already working freelance, then most of the pitfalls are things you deal with already. This makes contract work a natural step for many freelancers. In fact, it's just a part of freelancing now for many people. Questions and answers. Do you have any questions about this? It's pretty simple. Pretty straightforward. I'm going a little lighter on this because there's only so much to talk about without making it entirely its own talk. But let's see. If you are subcontracting, working for a studio with the contract who are paying you fraction of the fee. How would you put that on a resume? Do you list the client company or the studio is directly paying you? So if you can show that the project by way of that contract is for the parent company, then you'd want to do that. You'd want to say worked with this under the umbrella of that. It's okay to denote both. I was working for a company that was under the umbrella of Congregate, and they were like, you can say you worked for Congregate, but I actually listed both. I was like, I worked for this company under Congregate, and the work was through that pipeline. So you can kind of mention that that's the case if you feel that the weight of the parent studio is going to hold better than the smaller studio. But if there's no overlap, if it's like they just give them the money and the project is fully through that smaller studio or whatever, then or you know, you're just so far outside of it, then don't. Right? That's just, if it makes sense to mention the parent one, do mention the parent one, because you're probably gonna, you know, a good example, yeah, of that is if you're working with an outsourced studio. Like, let's say you work with outsourced studio Boobly Doo, and you're doing work by way of that studio for Activision's Call of Duty or Microsoft Activision Blizzard King's Call of Duty game. You can say, I did work for this at this outsourced studio for this client, and that's totally okay, because by mentioning Activision as part of that, even though it's implied in Call of Duty, you're going to be in better standing. Is contract work available for all levels or usually only seniors and above? Anyone can contract. In fact, sometimes juniors and mids will find more work contracting because they can't quite get in the studio, but they're able to cut their teeth for cheaper. Then we get into a discussion about pay rates and trying not to undercut other people, so you make next to nothing just so you can get that on your resume. Be careful about doing that kind of thing, because it's going to mix between, you know, I'm making better money, or I'm kind of doing things for almost free to get this on my resume, and then you're going to piss off a lot of other people who are in that area, that then we'll have companies going, well, this guy did it for $5. It's like, yeah, they were on Fiverr. Is there any platforms for contract work, or is it about contacting outsourced hiring managers? There will be message boards, collections of places. A lot of the times, honestly, contract work will be listed on hiring sites and like, you know, LinkedIn or whatever, but also just through company websites. Sometimes they'll have jobs listed and they'll actually say this is an internal role or this is a contract role. And that way you can kind of, if you're looking to do just like illustration contract for like card games and stuff, a lot of times there's art directors or whatever that have the public postings, and you just contact them. Just make sure you're going through proper channels. If it doesn't say there, like if for example, if you were talking about Hearthstone, there, when I was lead over there, sometimes people would contact me directly, and I was the 2D lead, but I wasn't working as outsource manager. That's not really the proper channel to be like, hey man, I want to work on this game, and I know you work on this game, so give me a job of that game. It's like, no, you should have found out who the outsourcing manager was, or asked some of the people who already do that work, like, who do I contact to find the proper channel? Because it kind of got annoying when I'm like, I'm not managing this, but you're contacting me, and I'm comfortable with that. You know, I was chill, and I would look at that, but some people would be like, dude, that's not my job, don't do that, and you don't listen to instructions, so why would I want to work with you? Right? That kind of thing. I think we're good for this section. Moving on.